Starting a podcast can be fun, exciting. Some would refer to it as exhilarating, and at the same time, very, very challenging and unknown, as is the world of business and entrepreneurship. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be starting a podcast. In this video, I'm going to share 3 things that nobody tells you about starting a podcast that I feel you need to know. I've been podcasting for over a decade now, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to turn it into a full-time business, helping people start a podcast and make all of their podcasting dreams a reality. But it hasn't always been as easy as one would think. You think after 10 years, you finally figured it out. Yes, I've been able to streamline and really remove a lot of the friction that's involved early on with the podcasting game in general. But I really look back at the journey since the beginning, and there's a few things that I wish I really knew before getting into it. And I think a lot of the reason that I didn't know it is that I was determined just to do it my own way. And the people that I did ask, maybe it wasn't the best advice. So in this video, I want to give you 3 tips, 3 insights, if you will, of what no one tells you when wanting to start a podcast or when you begin the process of starting a podcast. Let's get started. First thing no one tells you when starting a podcast is that it's going to be a lot of work. You've got to create the show. You've got to create the strategy, the brand. You've got to get equipment. You've got to record. You've got to figure out editing or find an editor. You've got to find all of these solutions in order to be able to create a podcast in general, but also be able to start creating content for that podcast. Then it goes a step further. Marketing a podcast isn't the easiest task in town. So you've got to have other tips, tricks, and tools along the way, like micro content, taking the podcast archived video and podcast archived audio and creating audiograms and micro video clips and images that you can post when the episode goes live. This way you can post on social media. Number 1, you've got an additional piece of content, but number 2, you're giving a call to action that, hey, a new podcast episode is up. And then you've got to start all over again. So you've got to be consistent with that whole process while figuring it all out. Experience shows us that a confused mind almost always says no. If it feels like work, we're just not going to do it. So I really wish someone would have told me 12 years ago, hey, listen, when you start doing this podcast work, it's going to be a little difficult. And you're going to have to actually put in the time and effort and work. When you know there's going to be work involved, then you can plan accordingly. If you know you don't want to do the work, well, you're going to find somebody who's going to be able to do the work. When you know what you like to do, well, you're going to start to do more of that. But realize, the first tip I got for you here of what no one tells you about starting a podcast is that it is work. I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm trying to make you better understand what the task at hand is. Whatever's on the other side of the work, way worth it. So don't let the work scare you by any stretch of the imagination. But when we talk about easy, there's not many things that are easy that actually are worth doing and have a direct benefit to them. So remember, when starting a podcast, it's gonna take work. And the good news is you can do it. Second tip I've got for you that no one really tells you when you're starting a podcast, and that is you've got to have a strategy that's going to inevitably benefit everybody involved. The person that you're interviewing, the people involved with the podcast, you, your brand, your business. It doesn't always have to be a monetary return. There's a lot of opportunities that come along that aren't just directly related to your bottom line. That's great and everything, and that should be a concern. But there's also relationships that are built, communities that are built, content that you're creating, the opportunity to allow yourself to be more consistent with your content game just by default because you have a podcast. But having a strategy is very important. You should be starting a podcast to do one thing, actually 2. Number 1, create content, multiple pieces of content, because starting a podcast, I firmly believe, can solve all of your social media content problems if properly executed with micro content. Completely different video on the channel, coming soon. Next is making sure that your podcast is a catalyst for you to be able to build new relationships and network with people, get in front of people, gain access that you wouldn't ordinarily have, but you do now because you've invited someone to be on your podcast to make it all about them, to stroke their ego, and at the same time build rapport with them, develop a relationship with them, and then identify whether or not there's an opportunity to do business or they need your product or service or you need them, etc. But having a strategy in place like this, hey, I'm starting a podcast because I want to share my story. I've got a message. I want to create content, and I also want to build relationships with people. I want to get in the door. I want to get access to people that I wouldn't ordinarily have access to. You've seen me do videos as far as sales and podcast on the channel before. And if you haven't, go check those out. But if you're in sales, most business owners and entrepreneurs are, it's your job to, well, sell what you do. If you interview someone, build rapport with them and a relationship with them and identify a need and a pain point that your service or product solves, bingo. It's almost a no-brainer to set up a conversation after that podcast interview that may very well lead to business. That's a great example of having a strategy. So tip number 2, have a solid strategy. Tip number 2 of that no one tells you when starting a podcast, have a rock solid strategy that actually converts to something that contributes back to your life, back to your business, back to your bottom line, back to the relationships and networking that you're doing to grow your business and your brand. Last tip I got for you on what no one tells you when starting a podcast is that it's going to take longer than you think. Of course, you could get lucky. You could have a show. It completely takes off. Maybe you've got an existing brand or personal brand that's already large with a following and a community built around it, and you're just dropping that podcast into that funnel. But most people are starting with zero. Most people are starting with a blank sheet of paper. And as with anything worthwhile in life, it's going to take time, effort, blood, sweat, tears, discipline, commitment, a strategy, all of the tips I've mentioned so far in this video to make that podcast a success. And success is yours to define. Most would define it as I've built a community. I've been able to monetize the opportunities and the content we're doing with the podcast. I've been able to, whatever the case may be, it's, again, yours to define on that, but it's going to take longer than you think, and it's also going to take as long as it's supposed to take. I know that that's kind of redundant to say, but a lot of people want it all tomorrow when you've got to build it. When you think of the analogy of creating anything, building a house, you're not going to go put the roof on before you lay the foundation out. You're not going to go pour concrete before you've surveyed the land. You're not going to decorate the house before you've got the roof on the house. I could go on and on and on with these very familiar examples that I'm giving here, but realize it's going to take work. I don't want to discourage you by any stretch of the imagination. I've been at this for 12 years now, and I still feel like I'm just getting started. But my life has been forever changed based on the relationships and opportunities that have come across my plate based on what I've been able to do with creating content, specifically with a podcast. So remember, it's going to take longer than you think. That doesn't mean it's going to take forever, but just be prepared to put in the work and know, hey, listen, it's going to take as long as it's going to take. And remember, you got this. Well, I hope you're leaving this video knowing at least 1 or 2, hopefully 3 things that you didn't know about what no one tells you when starting a podcast. My goal is to encourage you, it's to empower you with these videos and help you better understand what's possible. I want to help you make that tiny little shift to just believe in yourself a little bit more and better understand what it takes in order to succeed within the world of podcasting. If you got any questions about this video or any videos on the channel, please leave a comment below. I do respond to each and every one of you lovely people. Until next time,